Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Christine Ingram, Local Interest Librarian with the New Hanover County Public Library. Today marks the kickoff to a three-part series on African American service in the armed forces in honor of Veterans Day next week. Today we have with us Becky and Kaitlin from Fort Fisher. Becky is the collections manager and exhibits coordinator for Fort Fisher State Historic Site. With her 20-plus years of working with the North Carolina Historic Sites Division, Becky has worked at Bentonville Battleground and Fort Fisher. She has worked with the Civil War Trails program at Bentonville, curated battlefield wayside panels at both sites, and has curated several of the temporary exhibits at Fort Fisher. Kaitlin is a public historian at Fort Fisher State Historic Site. She is particularly interested in African American history and public programming to share those stories. At Fort Fisher, Kaitlin serves as the educator and outreach coordinator. She earned her bachelor's in history and will soon complete her master's in public history, both at NC State University. And with that, I hand it over to Becky and Kaitlin.
So I've been able to find more African American sailors who served at Fort Fisher, and I'm going to be talking about them in my presentation. Okay. During the American Civil War and World War II, Fort Fisher served as a pathway to freedom and eventually a temporary home for many African American men. As enslaved and free laborers, freedom seekers, sailors, and soldiers, African Americans influenced the outcome of wars and the future of the nation. Despite their diverse experiences and backgrounds, these men shared a common goal to obtain equality and freedom for themselves and for their families. Daily, they braved harsh weather, performed hard labor, endured racial discrimination while maintaining their dignity and fighting for full citizenship. The actions, achievements, and experiences of African Americans are important to the part of the history of Fort Fisher. And Fort Fisher is committed to incorporating diverse stories into the history told at the site. This image is of an unknown sailor, but he is one of many sailors that would have been at Fort Fisher during the two battles. Doing our research, we knew about Seaman John Hill on Ticonderoga, but we didn't know about these other men until recently. Landsman William Goodrich of the USS Colorado killed in action. John Hill, USS Ticonderoga, killed in action. Ordinary Seaman James Williams, USS Ticonderoga, he was wounded during the first battle. Coal heaver Zachariah Meade of the USS Osceola, he was scalded during the first battle. Seaman Charles H. Thomas of the USS Minnesota, missing in action during the second battle. Landsman Robert Boardman of the USS Colorado, he dies from his wounds in January of 1865. And Landsman Shadrach Hutchinson of the USS Monticello, killed in action on January 15th. And the image of the vessel is actually of the USS Minnesota. Okay. We're going to talk about Landsman William A. Goodrich. He was on the USS Colorado. Born in the West Indies, he was 20 years old when he enlisted in the U.S. Navy at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in August of 1864. He listed his occupation as sailor. He had hazel eyes, curly black hair, and was listed as mulatto. He was 5'3.5". And he was killed on December 25th, 1864 during the first battle when an incoming shell hit the gun that he was serving on, and shrapnel killed him and wounded several other men on the gun that he was serving on. He is buried at the National Cemetery in New Bern, North Carolina, among fellow sailors who were killed at Fort Fisher during the first battle. This is an image of his headstone up in New Bern, and right below it is the newspaper article from the New York Times from February 1st, 1865, and it lists William Goodrich as being killed during the first battle. Seaman John Hill of the USS Ticonderoga, born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1825. He enlisted in New York in 1863, and on the records it listed he had 15 years of previous maritime service. During the first battle of Fort Fisher on December 24th, a 100-pound Parrott gun that he was serving on exploded after the 37th shot, and killing Seaman John Hill and 6 other men who were serving on the gun. After the war, his mother, Rebecca Hill, filed for his pension, in which she was awarded $8 a month. And that's right. That one. It's easier. This was the pension record right here. And John Hill is buried at the National Cemetery in Newburgh, North Carolina. And this is his headstone right here. He is actually mentioned in the exhibit at Fort Fisher. So he was the first one that we had found out African-American sailors that were actually killed at Fort Fisher. Okay. Then we're going to talk about Ordinary Seaman James Williams, also of the USS Ticonderoga. So he was also serving on the 100-pound Parrott gun that exploded. Unfortunately, he was fortunate enough to survive. He had a fracture in his left leg in 2 places. He was sent to the Naval Hospital up in Norfolk, and the top is the incoming record describing his wound, and then this is his actual hospital record up at Norfolk. He would be discharged from the Navy Hospital after fully recovering on March 27, 1865. We're fortunate enough that the USS Ticonderoga, their deck logs have been digitized at the National Archives. Not all deck logs have been digitized. And so he is listed as one of the men wounded when the 100-pound Parrott gun exploded. Cole Heber Zachariah Meade of the USS Osceola, born in Baltimore, Maryland. Enlisted in August of 1864, occupation waiter. His description is black eyes, quote, crispy hair, and he was listed as a mulatto at 5'3". He was one of several men who were injured when a shot passed through the starboard boiler on the USS Osceola during the first battle. He was severely scalded. He was first sent up to the hospital at Morehead City, North Carolina, and then eventually to Norfolk, Virginia. What's interesting is how they were treating the burns with creosote, flour, and olive oil, and lots of morphine. He survives, and when it healed up, it said it resembled the shell of a tortoise. Amazingly enough, he survives to 1930. With these wounds. He is discharged from the hospital in 1866. He stayed on as a nurse, recovering from his wounds. He dies in Chicago, but buried in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And I just found his headstone last week when I was working on this presentation. So I was really happy to find that. So, because he's not buried in the National Cemetery, he's buried in a private, public cemetery. So it was very exciting, the history nerd of me, to find his headstone. And it says Cole Heber on the USS Osceola. Yeah. Seaman Charles H. Thomas of the USS Minnesota. He's kind of interesting. He is listed as missing in action after the Second Battle of Fort Fisher. He enlisted at Hampton Roads, Virginia in May of 1864, and actually said he came from the Army, but yet I've yet to find any records of him being in one of the United States Colored Troop regiments. There are other people by that same name in the USCT regiments, but they're dying in like August of 64 or May of 65, so it doesn't jive. But he was serving on the USS Minnesota during the battles of Fort Fisher, originally from Long Island, New York, and he was 48 years old when he enlisted in 1864. Per the deck logs of the Minnesota, he is mentioned as being missing in action after the second battle, along with John Williams IV, who were seen the day after the action. So it is possible that they could have died in the magazine explosion on January 16th. We just don't know, but and don't have any images. And of course, with him being missing in action, and if he died in the magazine explosion, there would be no headstone for him. Landsman Robert Boardman of the USS Colorado. He's actually born in St. John's, New Brunswick, Canada. So he's one of our Canadians. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Enlisted in the Navy at Portsmouth, New Hampshire at age 21 in September of 64. He's serving on the Colorado. He is one of probably many African Americans that were fought in the land attack on Fort Fisher, but he is wounded when a mini ball passed through his leg right below the knee. He is sent to Norfolk and eventually to the New York Naval Hospital. He would die from complications on February 23rd, 1865, and he's buried at the National Cemetery up in Brooklyn, New York. But the fact that he participated in the land assault is pretty spectacular that we do have that documentation now. And if you're into medical history, you can kind of cringe at some of this because they were treating it with water dressings on after they had cleaned out the wound and everything. But yeah, I didn't put it up here, but his record's about this long in the hospital up in New York, and it talks about how he just basically progresses, and he actually dies from blood poisoning. Yeah, not fun. And then Shadrach Hutchinson on the USS Monticello, born in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, either in 1838 or 1840. Served on the Monticello as a landsman, and he was killed in action when the gun he was serving on, which was a 9-inch gun, which is seen right here, prematurely discharged. It is unknown where Landsman Hutchinson is buried at. Again, the deck logs for the Monticello are not available yet. So I'm hoping next week when I go to the National Archives, I can get a copy of that and we can find out what happened to him, whether he was buried at sea or buried on land. And if he's buried on land, then he is one of the unknown burials at the National Cemetery here in Wilmington. And then I'm going to now turn it over to Kaitlin.
I got questions for you.
You got questions?
I had one for the first slide. Of course, I forgot it. So I had no questions unless I remember it.
I could go back to the first slide if you want me to.
Good job, my memory, maybe.
Yeah.
It's like,
What is a landsman?
Landsman. I honestly don't know. I think ordinary, if you are seaman is the lowest rank, ordinary seaman's above that, then landsman is how the ranking system goes. Yeah, so you're a little bit up in ranking.
I'm curious about the Confederate. Did you uncover any African Americans Confederate records?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we know they were there.
We know they were
got
there.
pensions later,
A lot of them, if they were there, they were serving as cooks or serving as teamsters.
Yeah.
The rest were basically, they were working on building the fort. We do have 100 names of African Americans that were impressed to work on Fort Fisher. But at serving a military role, there really isn't. They're just kind of put into slots to get, but in 1864, freed blacks could serve as cooks for the Confederate Army. Whether or not they got paid to be determined. You want to see about the first him or that one.
Let's try the next one. Everybody said. At least I got an image of these now, so at the end of. Oh, this one.
Uh-huh.
I find it interesting that, I guess my question is this took place at Fort Fisher. Was the National Cemetery here in Wilmington, that's why they were at Newburgh?
So
Okay.
the US Navy hospitals were set up at Beaufort and Morehead City.
Okay,
So if you were wounded during the battles of Fort Fisher, some were sent up there first and then eventually to Norfolk. There was a cemetery established nearby up at Beaufort. And then in 1867, when they established the national cemeteries in North Carolina, Newburgh, Raleigh, Wilmington, Salisbury, they start moving bodies to those national cemeteries. So more than likely, he was buried probably in Beaufort along with other sailors. And then when they established the national cemetery, that's when they got the headstone. So.
and I find it interesting on this one for whatever reason.
How his name is spelled, yeah.
Yeah, how his name is.
Yeah. They dropped William completely. And honestly, you see that a lot on headstones, misspelling of names. Several of the sailors that are buried up there, their names are botched up, and unfortunately, so.
Sorry, another question.
Uh-huh.
Would even the people that do the stones or bury the people, would they even have been literate? Like they were just maybe copying, not knowing what the letters
Probably
were.
not. It's a good question. Yeah. I'm gonna forward up to where Kaitlin can do that. Okay, and then turn over to Kaitlin.
All right, we'll lower the camera about a foot. Make sure, okay, which way it goes. All right, like Becky said, my name is Kaitlin. Thank you guys for coming out, and just wanted to give acknowledgement and thanks to Becky for all of this hard work that she's done to help diversify our history here at Fort Fisher. It's a change that needs to happen, and she's been doing a lot of work long before I came to do that, so thank you. I've only been at Fort Fisher for about 8 months now, but one thing that really interests me is our World War II history. So those of you who might not be aware, in the 1940s, the U.S. Army came back, took out some of our traverses or sandhills and put a giant runway in and turned us into an anti-aircraft and Coast Artillery training ground. So that's why you visit Fort Fisher, you see that big grass strip. That's a World War II runway. And so today I just want to talk a little bit about that World War II history as well, because I think it's so important to, sorry, I keep moving on your camera, to acknowledge. But first, let's just take a minute and figure out how the heck we get from 1865 to 1941, what's happening. So we heard a lot about Zachariah Meade and John Hill and Shadrach Hutchinson and their lives and the service in the Navy. And for a few decades at least, there were a lot of improvements in these gentlemen's lives. They started, most of them, in bondage, and then they have occupation of the South, the Freedmen's Bureau starting to push towards civil rights and a semblance of civilized society for the first time in our country. But of course, we had the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s when the white Northerners kind of give up. Well, you can argue they give up. There's actually a debate that, Reconstruction was never really about making the South an equal place for all people. The war was about reuniting the country and freeing the slaves, and they did that. And they started to reinforce voting rights. And kind of like we have done in a lot of our wars since, we just got tired of fighting a social justice mission and moved on. So they left the South to a home rule and their own devices. And so in North Carolina, it stays at a relatively peaceful state. I hate using that term, but by and large, for the scope of the South, it stays relatively peaceful till 1898 with the Wilmington massacre and coup d'etat here that reinstates white democratic rule and starts to bring in here Jim Crow regulations. So one thing I want to point out, Zachariah Meade, he was alive during Reconstruction, and he's alive living in Pennsylvania, but he's alive in 1898. And as all of these southern states go back to home rule and democratic white supremacist control. And so he lives through the Great War. He sees African Americans who were the same age as him in the Civil War go off and fight for democracy, come back home and are horribly treated with all sorts of slurs and actual lynchings and violence throughout the South that runs ragged. He lives till 1930s, so he really sees this rise and fall of rights for African Americans, particularly African American servicemen. I don't know why there it goes. Okay. So, World War II is raging over in Europe. It starts in 1939. Of course, we don't get involved until 1941. But in those 2-year periods, Americans really start to debate what our role is and whether or not we should get involved. There's a bit of an isolationism after World War I. We sent a lot of people over there to just brutal trench warfare, and for what? It didn't really benefit us directly at all. So that question starts to reemerge in 1939 and 1940. In the African American community in particular, it's a real debate. Should I become involved in a war against fascism and against racism abroad, racism against Jews, against Japanese and Koreans, when I am still fighting that battle right here at home? What is the point of that? And more so, I saw what happened to my uncle's generation, my father's generation, World War I. They went and fought, hoping their service would prove their citizenship, and they were met with violence upon their return. So it's a real debate in the African American community if they should be involved. And the counter argument from African Americans at the time is that this is my country. I'm going to serve when there's a call to serve. And it's going to be an opportunity for some. It's not a lot of opportunities, particularly in the segregated South, so it provides a steady paycheck and new job training and skills, right? Segregated schools have educational problems by comparison to white schools, and so many African American young men are having to leave school early in order to help out on farms as tenant croppers and sharecroppers. So there is this debate. Do I serve or do I not? Well, for the first African Americans who are here at Fort Fisher, it wasn't really a choice. This first group was drafted. So as you may know, in 1940, we have our first peacetime draft passed by FDR. And Black Northern voters actually helped push for a caveat in the legislation to make sure that African American men can serve. So if you read the text of the law, there shouldn't be any discrimination for service. Text of the law and the spirit of the law are not always the same thing in this country, regardless of the time period. Even more so here. So the Army at the time is run predominantly by white Southern men. And so they're going to continue segregation on regiments and on bases. On top of that, they have a lot of bases being built in the South as we ramp up for World War II. That 1940 Act I talked about also has a lot of funding to build new bases and to start preparing just in case war comes to America. So they start to build new bases. One of them becomes Camp Davis up in Holly Ridge. That is the home base, if you will, for soldiers at Fort Fisher. That's where they're really stationed. And then they'll come and do live fire training at Fort Fisher for a couple weeks or a month, then go back to Camp Davis. So we start seeing all of these bases pop up in the South because the South is really struggling after the Great Depression. In part of their own doing, they would not distribute or even take funds from the federal government, because doing so would require a level of integration or quality of the funding that they don't want to commit to. So we have this excessive poverty in the South. So one way that the government tries to fix it is to bring in military bases, hence military construction jobs into the region. And so we have these segregated bases like Camp Davis pop up. And so we have the 54th, the 99th, and the 100th Coast Artillery Regiments who come to Camp Davis sometime between March and May of 1941. I will say my master's thesis is on the 54th Coast Artillery Regiment, so that's the one I'll talk most about today. The 99th and 100th actually were founded, if you will, at Camp Davis in March and April. The 54th starts in Camp Wallace, Texas, right outside of Galveston. And so whether it's here at Camp Davis for the 99th and 100th, or it's Camp Wallace for the 54th, this is one of the first times the Army has really pulled men from everywhere and put them into a unit. Right, in the Civil War, we have like the 54th Massachusetts. They all pretty much come from Massachusetts. Here we have soldiers coming from the north, from Chicago, from Detroit, soldiers coming from Arkansas and Texas, even some from North Carolina and South Carolina, into these regiments. So we have a mix of people who have different understandings about what Jim Crow is. Some have lived it firsthand from the moment they were born, because they grew up in the segregated South. Others are children of what's called the Great Migration, meaning their parents or grandparents left the South for opportunity and went to the North. And so they've heard the stories of Jim Crow. And by any means, it's not saying the North was some oasis for anybody at the time, but it certainly didn't have the same level of in-your-face prejudice that you'll experience down here in the South. So this was new for men of the North to come down here. So a quick story. One of the men in the 54th, when they're at Camp Wallace, his name is Private William Jackson. He comes from Detroit, I believe it is. He comes down for camp, arrives sometime in late March, and his friend want to enjoy a little R&R. So they take a bus and go over to Galveston. It's one of the first stops on the route, so the first ones. And they go and sit right behind the bus driver, the first row, just come and sit down. And so the bus driver turns around and says, "You boys better get in the back of the bus." And Private Jackson later recalls that he didn't even realize what this guy was saying. He just thought maybe the back was more comfortable, or it's just a suggestion. So it's like, "No, it's okay, we're really comfortable here. I'll stay right here, thank you though." And so like, "No, you better get to the back of the bus." And so it's an exchange like this 1 or 2 times until the bus driver threatens to call the sheriff in, and now he's remembering what's going on. And so he and his friend do move to the back of the bus and go on with their day. He said that's his first real experience with Jim Crow in uniform, being told to move to the back of the bus. Okay. So like I said, they're at Camp Wallace in Texas. My other picture up. And something has to happen for them to come to Camp Davis here in North Carolina. Now, Wilmington, Carolina Beach, Curry Beach are really not as built up as they are today. So there's some beach activity, not like we know it to be today. But Galveston, Texas is a beach resort town. There's a lot of white wealth there that really enjoy things the white Southern way. So they're fine with the local Black people serving them at restaurants and things of this nature, working at the hotels. They're PO'd about the 54th coming to town at Camp Wallace in Galveston, Texas. And so they start writing to politicians and to the Army. And within a couple of weeks, the Army sends out orders to transfer the 54th from Camp Wallace to Camp Davis. racism interrupted these guys' training before it even really began. And so they transfer over to Camp Davis. And Camp Davis in Holly Ridge is very rural. It's still rural today, definitely was back then. There was all of 28 people or so living there when the camp started. So putting these men at Camp Davis kind of eases the race problem as the white army sees it, right? They're in an area all on their own. They're not near a big, wealthy white town. Okay. So they got to North Carolina. They really start settling in by the end of May or so, 1941, the 54th does. And life's not really all that much better. So this is a letter, anonymous letter written home at the start of June of 1941. Actually, I'll read that in a second. Let me tell you about a different letter that's written at the same time, that same month. Sergeants George Harvey and Ulysses Joyner of Battery D at the 54th, they write home to a woman named Mary. We don't know if it's a sister, a wife, some loved one, trusted loved one. And they ask her to get word out to the NAACP and the Black Press. And they detail 3 separate distinct instances of local police brutality against African-American soldiers, 54th, the 99th, and the 100th. And so they say these conditions are unbearable. And they are hoping for some sort of relief using what means they have through campaign with the NAACP and bringing attention to it with Black Press. And so it wasn't just the white MPs who were exacting a bit of, it's not even revenge, they were just being horrible to the Black soldiers. It's also the local white authorities as well. And so that same month, we have this anonymous letter that I started to talk about. Somebody wrote to their mother at the start of June. Remember, they don't really settle in to the end of May. So I'm going to step up so I can read it here. Actually, I can zoom in on my phone. So in June 1941, somebody writes, "Dear Mother, the conditions under which the colored troops have to live in North Carolina is outrageous. They catch northern white troops and colored troops because they are unarmed and beat them unmerciful. I am on the spot as I am looked on as dangerous because the boys look on me as their only protection because I am not afraid to tell these officers about their neglecting their duty. I have talked too much and I'm afraid that I will pay with my life. The beatings are on northern white troops as well as coloreds, and southern white boys are the only ones with weapons. I am in a hurry, but see Mary Greenfield for further details." That's probably the Mary the other gentlemen were writing to as well. So within a few weeks, they are already writing home and experiencing the full force of Jim Crow here in Wilmington. So as all of this is going on, the new regiment, the 54th, gets to select a motto. And this is really driven by the soldiers themselves with approval of their white officers. But they select per ardua as their motto, which is Latin for through difficulties. So these were men who were predominantly drafted into the army, so it didn't really matter what they thought of that debate I talked about at the start, whether you should serve or not. Their number was called, and unless they wanted to spend years in prison, they put on the uniform and showed up. So what was it going to mean now that we're here? What are we going to make of ourselves, even with all of this stuff, all of this racism going on around us, all of these people trying to prove that we are what they think we are? And they choose that motto, through difficulties. They endeavor to become the best soldiers that they can to prove themselves as both men and soldiers. And that's important in our nation. We tie military service to citizenship, right? Even today, if you want to improve yourself, a great way to do that is to join the Army and get your GI Bill, go to college, all of these things. You get recognized for your service, as you should. But the same idea. If we can prove ourselves as serviceable to our nation, then we have a right to claim those rights to full citizenship on the other side of the war. And so they studied hard for their Coast Artillery tests. They earned the high regards, the white and black press alike. The 54th Regimental Band plays quite frequently at Williston High School, the local segregated high school, and is frequently at events for both Black and white soldiers in the area. And they're actually, in October of 1941, the 54th becomes the very first unit to train at Fort Fisher when it is opened in World War II. And so when Pearl Harbor is attacked at the end of the year, they're the only newly formed Coast Artillery Regiment ready to go. So they have done that. They have started to prove, even at the start of the war, that no matter what people throw at us, we're going to persevere through difficulties. And they continue to do that. So there's 3 battalions of the 54th. The 1st and 3rd go to California for the bulk of the war. At the time, they're sent in about February of 1942, and that is in response to a feared additional Japanese attack on our western coast. So they are sent out west, and they stay there for the bulk of the war. The 2nd Battalion ends up in the Pacific Theater, where they served as combat support as the American forces do island hopping and slowly work their way into mainland Japan. I guess you could say mainland Japan, even though it's all islands anyways. So they served in over 400 missions, and they even served as combat support for the 95th Infantry, or Small Black Regiment in the Pacific. And so just one example of what they're doing out here in the Pacific. In March of 1944, American forces came under heavy Japanese counterattack. But the 2nd Battalion returned fire with precision and devastation and helped turn the tide of that battle. But for their actions, they earned 6 Bronze Stars with accommodations, and 2 men were killed and 3 were wounded. The regiment didn't suffer incredibly heavy casualties, but they certainly were involved in a lot of action. And so while the 2nd Battalion's out in the Pacific Theater for 2.5 or so years during the bulk of the war, the 1st and 3rd Battalions are spread out along the California coast. They wake up every day and stand post at their guns, even though it becomes quite clear that it doesn't seem like anything's really coming for them, but they do their duties, again, win the praise of the local white press. There's not really a black press in California, though the black press nationally does occasionally cover them throughout the war as well. And while they're there, they already start to put in the work to integrate themselves into the local Californian society. For example, in Santa Cruz, they start to buy houses, start to get involved however they can. There's even one story I found from the local Santa Cruz paper where at first local white businesses did not want to welcome them, even out in California, but they kept coming back and pushing the issue, so much so that one of the white officers came and told the business that they would not get any business from any of the soldiers in the Army stationed there, white or black, unless they let the black soldiers in as well. So we see that tide start to shift, which brings us to kind of a more academic question that I really need to get into, but there's this question about when does the civil rights movement start? And some people like to argue it starts with World War II. because of activism we see like that. We see with bus boycotts and other sorts of military-driven service and protests throughout the war. But like I said, this 54th Coast Artillery Regiment that stays in the Santa Cruz area in California becomes active. They will stay, about a dozen of them stay in that city with their wives and with their families after the war. And this gentleman right here, Private Isaac Jackson, although that is taken of him in 1980s, so he's quite a bit older. They formed a chapter of the NAACP in 1949. And Jackson, as well as the wife of Private Henry Pratt, they earned humanitarian lifetime achievement awards from the NAACP in the 1980s. And by the 1990s, the local paper in Santa Cruz starts to credit these soldiers of the 54th for integrating Santa Cruz County and for pushing for real change out in California. So World War II isn't really necessarily a starting point of what we think of the civil rights movement with, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But you'll see when you read stories from Isaac Jackson and William Jackson, their experience with that segregation on the bus in uniform and living out in California where they're supposed to be protecting the local population and at first not even being welcomed by them, it changes something in them that will later push them into civil rights activism. That's why we see the NAACP branches forms in 49, not right away. At first, these men were interested in getting jobs when they got out of service, right? That's their main focus. But as you read their stories, that's what shifts for them, how they're treated in World War II. And it inspires this action that comes 5, 10, 15 years later throughout the country. So that's just a little paint on the wall about our World War II history as well as our Civil War history as well. But, one of the things I really enjoy about being a public historian is we emphasize a collective approach, which means I could spend all day in the archives, Becky could spend all day in the archives, but you guys might have stories that we don't have, and that would be fantastic. So, particularly if you have any living memory or indirect memory of these soldiers here in Wilmington for World War II, we would love to hear about that. Please, especially since I'm doing my thesis, so I'm not afraid to ask for a little extra help with that. And one of the biggest things we are starting to look for and want, hopefully have some community support for, is we would love in all of our programming to have this opportunity to tell about the Black sailors, to tell about our U.S. colored troops, to tell about the 54th and the other African-American soldiers. The way we mostly do that at Fort Fisher and historic sites is through living historians. So if you or anyone you know is particularly interested, we would love to have you out, dress you up, teach you, train you up, and form our own USCT/Civil War Sailor /World War II reenactor regiment. So if you're interested in that, or you want more information to pass along to people, please, I'll give you my business card. I'll buy you lunch. I will do anything you want for that. But anyways, thank you guys for coming out. Do you have any questions for me? Yes.
I'll ask them one, and I'll pause for somebody else. But I found it interesting when you were talking this time period and these camps being founded when you're talking about that. And was there any connections with Fort Fisher or in New Hanover County or in this just part of the country or part of the state as far as the formation of these places that are Camp Davis, which I'm not familiar with these places? Any connection with the CCC camps that were going on prior to
Not that I'm aware of, what are the
Okay.
CCC camps? I've never heard of
The
them.
conservation.
The Civil Civilian
The
Conservation
Civilian
Corps
Conservation Corps, they're the ones thinking of.
Yeah.
dealing with repression.
Yeah, I see them mostly out west, I think, here in North Carolina, but
Yeah.
I don't know of any here on the coast per se.
Okay.
You're with the
Yeah.
Virginia, they were in that.
Yeah,
out
yeah,
in the Appalachians.
There's several,
They worked on the Parkway.
yeah.
yeah, that was one of the,
Okay.
there are camps,
Yeah.
They did a lot of work on the Parkway.
there are camps, so.
Yeah.
You know, two different
Well,
dogs.
they did them out in New York too.
Oh, yeah, all over the country, I mean, that was a big thing because it was lifting the country out of the depression.
Part of that
It was a way
great
to-
deal,
yeah.
a new deal.
Yeah, right, no, yes, it was part of all the New Deal, deal with the depression and stuff. And it was Roosevelt's smart way of trying to train
Yeah.
soldiers indirectly
Mhm.
when he saw Hitler and the rise of, he had plenty of time in the mid-30s with the rise of Nazis.
That was also a good way to teach them the trade.
Absolutely, yeah, and African Americans really did benefit from that
Mhm.
to a large degree, learning skills and that type of stuff.
Yeah, so I will say, like Becky said, I guess we don't have any connection with the CCC, but building Camp Davis brings in a lot of contractors. Most of them are white, but I've seen records of colored laundresses coming in and serving. So it definitely provides job opportunities here as well. In the South, we see problems with that being carried out in an equitable way across racial lines, as I'm sure you might be aware with your own research. So, but it is starting to happen here. We have Black carpenters building Fort Fisher and Black laundresses serving Camp Davis, which is only about 40 miles or so north of here, so it's relatively close. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, do you have any idea on more or less how many people of color served in the Civil War? Or
As a
were-
whole in the country, I want to say it's around 180,000 was the last number I read for the U.S. colored troops only, and the sailors. I don't know if Becky done more on the sailors. People are in the Navy and Civil War.
There are, I don't have an exact number. I know Emily had been pulling all those records for the fleet at Fort Fisher per se.
I don't know
Um,
nationwide.
How many did you have that they feel they had done in this area?
Well, specifically Black sailors who come from Wilmington or Southport, this region in general, there were 67 that we know of that served. Most of those escape bondage and choose to serve in the Navy. And there are more who escape but do not end up enlisting. And I believe we have a much longer list of African-American sailors who just came from Maryland and Virginia and farther up north as well. I want to say that's a couple hundred. It's gotta be.
There's probably at least, I would say maybe 500, I
Yeah.
would say total. And you also have Black sailors that enlisted in Mobile Bay, Mobile, after the fall of Mobile in August of '64. They're with the fleet as well, we know of. So. But you see a lot of African American sailors from the West Indies, down in the Caribbean, Canada, I mean, New York, Baltimore, Philly, up and down the East Coast. So, and then also the former enslaved men who sought their freedom, basically floating out on little boats down the Cape River to the blockading squadron. William Gould is one example at the Bellamy Mansion. He was one among like 25, 26 men during the yellow fever epidemic in September of '62 that sought their freedom to the Union fleet. And most of them did end up joining the US Navy. And many of them were with the fleet during the two battles of Fort Fisher and then eventually the occupation of Wilmington. What's interesting is some of those men, once Wilmington falls, they are released from the US Navy. They're done with their service and they go back to living in Wilmington after the war, after Wilmington falls, actually. So.
That answer your question to the best of our abilities. Any other questions? So I'll go back to Tim.
I had a quick comment that it was really, it kind of made me stand up a little bit more erect in my seat. I'm former Army, field artillery, and those are the colors that, the colors of the insignia.
Yeah.
So it's really, it hasn't changed much. It looks a lot like what I had on my shoulders as far as my little pins or representatives, really close. You know, got the cross cannon somewhere in there, but again, Coast Artillery in particular. So that was really neat. So I saw that just made me stand up and say, wow, that was really, really cool. Same colors and everything. It's pretty much the same design.
A little totally unrelated tidbit for you guys. I go to NC State. NC State's red, right? That really comes from our ROTC program being kind of catering cadets into artillery, and the color of artillery is red. So that's a holdover, and then it'll lead into our sports teams as well.
We call red legs.
Mhm. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Do you have any information? I apologize for being late.
That's okay.
I thought this was Hidden Valley Library. I could not find it. But I would ask, do you have information on the Montfort Point Marines? The first African Americans to be able to enlist in the Marine Corps?
Yeah, I don't have any relevant to my job, at least. They weren't training at Fort Fisher or anything.
But one of our Medal of Honor recipients, his grandson was a Montfort Point Marine.
Yeah, so one of these black, is he soldier or sailor?
Soldier.
Black
He's
soldiers.
with the New York Regiment.
Yeah. Bruce Anderson?
Bruce Anderson,
Oh, okay.
yes.
Yeah, Bruce Anderson actually was able to pass for white or something. We don't know exactly, but he ended up in a white regiment in the north, 117th New York, I guess. 142nd New York. And so serves at the Battle of Fort Fisher, it's Medal of Honor. And his grandson is a Montfort Point Marine, as well as I believe, guy, what's his name? I forget his name right now. Rode down the river and I had the plaque for him. Waist side panel on.
Gould?
Yeah, Gould. I believe one of his sons.
I know both of his sons were either in the Spanish-American War or World War I.
Okay, I thought he had some connection, but I must be conflating the two then.
Yeah.
I
they
apologize.
were a little bit late.
But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have much information relevant to the Montfort Point Marines other than the little bits we just read as interest, just because the Marine Corps is separate. I will say, studying kind of that 1940 Act that started the draft, US Army is the only one that allows Black people to enlist, with the caveat that you can enlist in the Navy to serve as a mess man, right, serve food to white officers. The Marines, up until those Montfort Point Marines, are completely outlawing African American enlistees. So sorry, I don't have more information for you than that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I may be mistaken. The gentleman that was with you, he seemed very, very knowledgeable. Do you think he would be one that would also be knowledgeable? That he was very impressive.
Yeah, I can give you his contact.
So
He
yeah,
might
just-
know more, because he's done a lot of World War II research. His name's John Mosley.
All right, everyone, that's about all the time we have. We want to thank Becky and Kaitlin again. Thank you so much for your time and for bringing this wonderful presentation to us. Thank you. We do have two more lectures in this series. The next one is Wilmington's Black military veterans from the Civil War to World War II. This will be at the Northeast Library on Thursday, November 3rd. So Thursday coming up from 6 to 7. And then our final one for this series is going to be the Grand Army of the Republic and its auxiliaries in Wilmington. That'll be at the Downtown Library next Wednesday, November 9th from 6 to 7 p.m. as well. So again, thank you all for joining us and thank you to our presenters. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, like I said, we have some more brochures, got more info